This week, as I sat with that blank paper in front of me, ready to write the sermon, I wrote the title on top of my page, Still There Is Light. Now, even as I wrote those words, part of my brain wanted to fight that entire premise. 'Tis the season of light, they say, but also 'tis the season of stress, of trying to affirm my love through gifts, of having to face relations whose opinions and values may seem counter to our own. And for far too long, it's been the season of listening to the news of a world marred in catastrophe, tension, and hate. So the words sat on the page alone for a long while as I pondered my resistance to their truth. Still there is light. Now, perhaps my resistance was fed by my sore arm that I was nursing after a third vaccine in the continuing fight against a global pandemic. Those words roll off the tongue too easily now, don't they? Global pandemic. Still there is light. I added a question mark to the end of the phrase and was reminded, too, of the first aphorism of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Now, these Yoga Sutras were written about 1,600 years ago. They were compiled by a man named Patanjali. The material itself is much like the Taoist Tao Te Ching in that it's not the work of one author, but is a combination of a canon of much older wisdom. Now, the first lines in this ancient teaching translate simply as, now the practice of yoga. The Sanskrit word for yoga means to yoke or to unite, and it's said to refer to the uniting of our individual or ego consciousness with the universal or collective consciousness. Some of the many commentaries on the Yoga Sutras just brush over this first stanza, claiming it's just an introduction to the real teachings that are to come. However, I have always viewed these first words not so much as a preface as an entrance exam question. And now, the practice of unity? The implication being that after living in the false shadow of separation, resistance, attachment, and ego, the sages would first need to ask the practitioner, are you really finally ready to practice living in union? Are you ready to experience life as interconnected, as unified, as whole, and dare I say, as good? So I wrote that question too. And now, the practice of union, beside my sermon title, Still There Is Light. The questions both hung there together, waiting for me to answer and affirm their view of the world, one where unity and light do exist. But then I felt the urge to write a third statement down. So beside them I wrote, affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of all. It is the Unitarian Universalist first principle, and it is a commitment to hold each person in the light of wholeness, and at its core is one of the core tenets of our faith. A fundamentalist colleague in our interfaith group once said to me, he said, the difference in our faiths is that you see people as born good and whole, and we view them as broken and in need of salvation. I said yes to his statement, feeling, I admit, a bit proud about our goodness. But silently I wondered, do we? As a Unitarian Universalist minister, perhaps the question I have heard most is some version of, must I really see the inherent worth and dignity in everyone? Everyone? No, really, everyone? We don't really mean everyone, do we? And by extension, I think we also ask, is there really light even in the darkest days of our lives? Even amongst the devastation of climate change, capitalist greed, racism, queerphobia, misogyny, and the list goes on. Within the heap of a mess that life can sometimes be, can we really feel unified with all? So I added a question mark to our first principle and added it to my list. Affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of all. Still there is light. Now, the practice of unity. Such simple questions, and yet each made me take a long, honest pause. Were all these phrases and ideas just spiritual gibberish, nice thoughts, good intentions, yet solely and sorely impractical, unrealistic, and truly unattainable? Or maybe, could it be that they were not answers, but more of a roadmap? Something to provide a direction to follow. To live as Unitarian Universalists, we cannot simply espouse spiritual ideals, for ours is a faith of action. We must figure out how to live them. I like to say that Unitarian Universalism is not a faith that will give you the answers, but it is one that will poke you in the side until you are willing to go out and find them for yourselves. Fortunately, we do not have to go far to start finding the light, do we? Have you ever walked into what you thought was a totally dark room, only to notice in a few moments later how your eyes relaxed and adjusted, and there actually was light? I love the story of the simple clay Buddha that was found in 1957. Perhaps you know it. At the time, an entire monastery in Thailand was being relocated by a group of monks. And one day they began to move this giant clay Buddha when one of the monks noticed a little crack in the clay. So they looked closer and they saw that there was some golden light coming through. So the monk got out a hammer and chiseled away at this thick clay exterior to reveal that in fact it was a large Buddha statue made entirely of gold. The statue was thought to have been built around 1400 and was revered by the Buddhists for many hundreds of years. But then in 1757, the Burmese army invaded Thailand. Facing complete annihilation, the Buddhist monks at the monastery must have hastily covered this golden Buddha with plaster and clay. And then they painted it and inlaid it with like little bits of colored glass to make it look of little or no value. During the invasion, all the Buddhist monks were tragically murdered, but this nearly 10-foot tall, 5-ton golden Buddha was left intact and remained undiscovered for 200 years. Perhaps this is what we do too. When we feel threatened, it seems like a sensible thing to cover up our light, to hide that which is the gold inside of us. And don't many of us live in a perpetual state of feeling threatened by the world these days? And the truth is, it can take a long time to peel dry clay from around us to let out that light. And so we can convince ourselves that we are really not light-filled at all. We begin to believe in the clay exterior. Imagine if there was a society of golden Buddhas who were to do this, and they gathered in a room covered in their clay, and they started judging each other's exteriors, pointing out all the dullness of the clay and all the unseemly little cracks and the cheap jewelry. Perhaps to see the light in the dark, we must be willing to expose our light as well. The Buddhist teacher Tara Brach, who was actually raised as a Unitarian Universalist herself, speaks of this inner gold in her new book, Trusting the Gold. And in it, she encourages us to remember the gold in ourselves as a doorway to seeing the light of others. She reminds us that even in the midst of suffering, we can pause and behold the basic goodness that shines through each of us. In her book, she reminds us to be proactive in our search for the light. We need to make the decision to behold it. She offers 3 directives: to trust the moment, to turn toward love in any situation, and to practice non-judgmental awareness. I read this book the other day, and I started to think that perhaps my resistance to this idea of the light was more about my expectation that the light was somehow supposed to just show up and find me, instead of me finding it. But then again, I thought maybe I do that with the dark too. I just assume it is there, forgetting that sometimes it is I who creates the darkness. It is I who turns out the light. I've always thought that idea of being in the closet was such a profound description. Stuffed in a dark place, unable to move or be truly who you are, your light blocked by the door. And then one day you open the door. And I'm sure it's different for everyone, but some of my friends have spoken about how it can take a few minutes for your eyes to get used to the light after you come out of the dark. I don't have a sexual or gender orientation closet to come out of, but I have often felt that I've been in a self-constructed little dark room. Perhaps you have one of those as well. My closet is called self-judgment. It is the dark place I go when I want to hide my light or pretend it was never there. Inside that little closet, I make lots of lists that help me stay inside. Have you ever been in that dark closet yourself? Perhaps yours has a different name. It's hard to see anyone else's light when we keep ourselves in dark closets by whatever their names. Whether it's that protective clay we cover ourselves with or the closets we stuff ourselves into, the end result is the same. We miss out on experiencing our own light. We miss out on sharing that light of others. And perhaps most profoundly, we often miss seeing the beauty of others' light. Have you ever noticed how terrible other people are when you're not feeling good about yourself? They become really easy to judge. Sometimes I like going to shopping centers as a spiritual practice, and no, I'm not talking about retail therapy, but instead the ancient art of people watching. Now maybe nowadays people do this on social media. I still like going to the mall. But wherever you watch others, this practice is to look for their light. When I try, I'm always amazed at how easy it is to judge others before I get to the light part. Have you noticed that? Like even today when you walked in, what were all your first thoughts as you glanced at each other? How many of you said, "Oh, there's light and there's light. I love your light. I see your light. I see you. I see you. I see you." Of course, to find the light, you must believe that it is there. Unitarian Universalism doesn't pretend to claim that everything that humans do is good or that all parts of us are pure light, because humans, in fact, do some really nasty, hurtful, harmful, bad things. But Unitarian Universalism invites us to affirm that inside each of us is a golden light of goodness, that we are born with that light, and that now is the time for us to practice living in unity. This is why I'm drawn to this faith. It recognizes human goodness, even in the darkness. Affirming and promoting this light in each person is perhaps the greatest act of our faith that we can do. I think it's our communion cup. It's our sacred act. It is our practice, and I think now is a good time to embrace it. I'm going to close this morning with this lovely story from the poet Naomi Shihab Nye, because I think it profoundly illustrates the lesson of light and sharing our light. Naomi writes this. She says, wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal after learning my flight had been delayed 4 hours, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of gate A4 understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, she says, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my own gate. Can you imagine that moment? Do you know that moment where you know you're being called to do something and there's that little tiny pause? Am I going to call in sick on this one? She says, I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumbled to the floor, wailing. Help, said the flight agent. Talk with her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late and she did this. I stooped to put my arm around the woman and spoke haltingly. Shudo shubikak habita. Goes on. I'm not going to try to translate the Arabic. The minute she heard any words she knew, however poorly I spoke them, she stopped crying. She had thought that the flight had been canceled entirely, and she needed to be in El Paso for a major medical treatment the next day. I said to her in Arabic, no, we're fine. You'll get there, just later. Who is picking you up? Let's call them. We called her son. I spoke with him in English. I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane and ride next to her, and she talked to him. Then we called her other sons just for the fun of it. Then we called my dad, and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course, that they had 10 shared friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? And this all took about 2 hours. And she was laughing a lot by then, telling of her life, patting my knee, answering questions. And she had pulled out a sack of homemade momol, which are cookies, little powdered crumb cookies that were mounded, stuffed with dates and nuts that were in her bag. And she began offering them to all the women at the gate. And to my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo, we were all covered with the same powdered sugar, all smiling. There was no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free apple juice from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving it, and they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves. Such is the way in the old country. Always carry a plant, always stay rooted to somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones, and I thought, this is the world I want to live in. The shared world. Not a single person in that gate, once the crying and confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies, and I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. Isn't that a beautiful story? The earth shows us that even in the longest, darkest night, the sun does return. By our willingness to look for and find the places of unity with others, we too affirm that our light and their light will return again and again. We affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all does exist. And yes, I will say, still there is light. Yes, I'm ready for the practice of unity, although my practice will be imperfect. And yes, I affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all. My friends, may this season of returning to the light enliven your heart. May you look for and find the glowing light of love in your life. and in the eyes of everyone you encounter. And may you share the joy of cookies as often as possible.